In the remote mountains of Eldoria, where the Whisperwind Pass carved its treacherous path toward the western frontiers, there once stood a manor that travelers spoke of in hushed, reverent tones. Shadowbrook Manor, they said, offered something no other establishment could provide. A warmth that went far beyond clean beds and hot meals. For sisters ran this mountain sanctuary, and weary men would arrive as strangers, but leave feeling like they had discovered something precious, something worth the perilous journey back. The Blackwood sisters had a reputation that spread across 3 lands. Merchants would delay their business trips just to spend extra nights at Shadowbrook Manor. Cattlemen would take dangerous detours through hostile mountain passes rather than miss the opportunity to experience the sisters' legendary hospitality. And those who had stayed there spoke of comforts that lonely travelers rarely found. Attention so personal, so intimate that grown men would weep when it came time to leave. But in the winter of 1851, something changed. Travelers began arriving at settlements throughout Eldoria with disturbing tales. The path to Shadowbrook Manor, they claimed, had become littered with abandoned wagons and riderless horses. Local authorities dismissed these reports as frontier hysteria until a pattern emerged that could no longer be ignored. Dozens of men had vanished without a trace, and the last place anyone remembered seeing them was on the winding mountain trail that led to the Blackwood sisters' welcoming door. What authorities were about to discover would reveal that the warmth travelers found at Shadowbrook Manor came with a price far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The year was 1831 when Silas Blackwood succumbed to consumption, leaving behind a thriving mountain estate and 4 daughters ranging in age from 16 to 26. Located in the remote highlands between Sunken Vale and the Eldorian frontier, the Blackwood property sprawled across 800 acres of fertile mountain, complete with livestock, grain fields, and most importantly, a strategically positioned manor that served travelers heading west on the Whisperwind Pass. Eleanor, the eldest at 26, possessed the sharp mind of a born businesswoman and the cold, calculating nature that would later prove so deadly. Serafina, 24, had inherited their mother's ethereal beauty and an almost supernatural ability to make any man feel like the most important person in the world. Isolde, 22, shared her late mother's knowledge of mountain herbs and their various properties, knowledge that would prove far more sinister than anyone imagined. And Lyra, the youngest at 16, possessed an innocent charm that could disarm even the most suspicious traveler. The Blackwood estate had been built by their grandfather in 1798, when the Whisperwind Pass was little more than a dangerous trail carved through hostile territory. By 1831, it had evolved into one of the most respected stopping points for merchants, settlers, and adventurers heading toward the promise of Eldoria's fertile plains. The main house, a substantial 2-story log structure with stone foundations, sat prominently on a ridge overlooking the valley below. The manor portion consisted of 6 comfortable guest rooms, a large common area with massive stone fireplaces, and a kitchen capable of feeding dozens. What made the Blackwood place special wasn't just its location or amenities. It was the reputation for hospitality that had been carefully cultivated over 3 decades. Travelers would speak in towns hundreds of miles away about the warmth of the Blackwood welcome, the quality of their mountain spirits, and the comfort of clean beds after weeks on dangerous roads. Silas had built something more valuable than gold: trust. The property employed a small but loyal staff. Gideon Thorne, a weathered mountain man in his 50s, had worked as foreman since the manor's early days. His knowledge of the mountains was encyclopedic, and his loyalty to the Blackwood family was absolute. 2 foreign immigrants, the Grimm brothers, Victor and Rolf, had arrived 3 years earlier, seeking work and stability in the New World. They lived in a cabin near the property's eastern boundary and managed the livestock and agricultural operations with meticulous efficiency. The autumn of 1831 marked the beginning of what locals would later remember as the manor's golden years. The sisters, initially working together out of necessity, discovered they possessed a remarkable ability to make guests feel not just welcome, but genuinely cherished. Eleanor's business acumen kept the operation profitable. Serafina's charm kept guests lingering longer than planned. Isolde's knowledge of mountain cooking and medicinal teas enhanced their reputation for comfort, and Lyra's youthful enthusiasm made even the weariest travelers smile. But something darker was stirring beneath this facade of mountain hospitality. The isolation that had once protected the Blackwood family from the dangers of frontier life now provided something else entirely: privacy. And privacy for 4 young women with sharp minds and few scruples could be a dangerous thing indeed. It was a November evening in 1832 when Arthur Pendleton arrived at Shadowbrook Manor, and with him the first hint of the darkness to come. Pendleton was a cattle buyer from Silverwood City, traveling alone with a substantial purse of gold coins intended for purchases in Eldoria. He was a man of 45 years, recently widowed, with no children and few close ties. Precisely the type of guest the sisters would later learn to identify with terrifying precision. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and a light snow was beginning to fall when Pendleton's horse stumbled up the winding path to the manor. Eleanor greeted him at the door with her practiced smile, noting immediately the quality of his clothes, the weight of his saddlebags, and most importantly, the loneliness in his eyes. A man traveling alone just 1 year after losing his wife was carrying more than just money. He was carrying a desperate need for human connection. "Welcome to Shadowbrook Manor," Eleanor said, her voice carrying just the right mixture of professionalism and warmth. "I'm Eleanor Blackwood, and these are my sisters. We'll make sure your stay is everything you need it to be." Pendleton's eyes brightened as he took in the warm glow of the common room, the smell of Isolde's venison stew, and the sight of Seraphina arranging fresh wild flowers despite the season. This was exactly what a lonely widower needed: a place where beautiful, attentive women would treat him like family rather than just another paying customer. Over the next 3 days, the sisters provided Pendleton with an experience unlike any he'd ever encountered at an inn. Isolde's meals were restaurant-quality feasts featuring perfectly seasoned game, fresh bread, and her famous honey cakes. Eleanor engaged him in lengthy conversations about business and politics, making him feel intellectually valued. Lyra's innocent laughter at his stories made him feel worldly and important, but it was Seraphina who provided what Pendleton truly craved: the illusion of romance. On his second evening, after the other guests had retired, Seraphina found Pendleton sitting alone by the fire, staring into the flames with the hollow expression of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. She approached with 2 glasses of Isolde's special spiced rum, each warming perfectly in crystal tumblers that caught the firelight. "You seem troubled, Mr. Pendleton," she said, settling into the chair beside him with fluid grace. "Sometimes sharing a burden makes it lighter." For the next 2 hours, Pendleton found himself pouring out his heart to this beautiful woman, who listened with such genuine attention. He spoke of his late wife, Ilara, of their failed attempts to have children, of returning each evening to an empty house that still smelled faintly of her lavender soap. Seraphina listened with perfect sympathy, occasionally touching his hand or leaning closer with apparent compassion. "Loneliness is a terrible thing," she said softly as the fire burned lower. "But it doesn't have to be permanent." What happened next was never recorded in any official document. But Pendleton's behavior the following morning told its own story. He moved through breakfast with the satisfied expression of a man who had rediscovered reasons for living. He extended his stay by 2 additional days despite his original urgency to reach Eldoria. Most tellingly, he began making plans to return to Shadowbrook Manor on his journey home to Silverwood City. The sisters also developed an extensive network of business relationships that helped legitimize their growing wealth. They invested in land purchases throughout the region, gradually assembling a portfolio of properties that generated rental income and appreciated in value. They loaned money to local farmers and merchants, earning both interest payments and influence within the community. They even purchased shares in several riverboat companies operating on the Serpent's Coil River, diversifying their investments while creating additional sources of income. By 1845, the Blackwood sisters were among the wealthiest landowners in western Eldoria. Their success story was held up as an example of what determined women could achieve, even in the challenging frontier environment. Local newspapers occasionally featured articles about the enterprising Blackwood sisters, who had built a thriving business empire from their inherited mountain property. But beneath this facade of legitimate success lay the carefully concealed bones of more than 40 men who had made the fatal mistake of accepting the sisters' hospitality. Each death had added to their wealth and refined their methods, creating a cycle of murder and profit that seemed impossible to stop or detect. The isolation that had initially protected them from discovery now provided something even more valuable: the perfect environment for their predatory activities. Shadowbrook Manor had become a spider's web, beautiful and inviting on the surface, but deadly to anyone who became entangled in its strands. The beginning of the end came not from law enforcement or suspicious relatives, but from an unexpected source: one of their own employees. Rolf Grimm, the younger of the two Grimm brothers, had been growing increasingly unstable since a hunting accident in the fall of 1849 that left him with chronic pain and a dependence on a potent herbal sedative for relief. Rolf had always been the more sensitive of the Grimm brothers, and the years of participating in the sisters' crimes had taken a psychological toll that his brother Victor either ignored or failed to recognize. The sedative, initially prescribed by Isolde for legitimate pain relief, had gradually become Rolf's escape from the guilt and nightmares that plagued his sleep. But addiction brought its own problems: paranoia, mood swings, and a tendency toward loose talk that made him increasingly dangerous to the operation. The crisis began on a cold February morning in 1850 when Rolf appeared at the kitchen door of the main house, his eyes wild with drug-induced panic and his clothes disheveled from a sleepless night. Isolde was alone in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for a traveling merchant from Azure Coast who had arrived the previous evening, a man the sisters had already identified as their next target. "I can't do it anymore," Rolf whispered, his voice shaking with emotion. "I see their faces every night. Every time I close my eyes, they're all standing there watching me. 43 men, Isolde. 43 souls crying out for justice." Isolde maintained her composure, but her mind raced as she calculated the threat Rolf now represented. His knowledge of their crimes was complete and detailed. He could provide authorities with exact locations of burial sites, descriptions of murder methods, and testimony that would send all four sisters to the gallows. Serafina perfected the art of emotional manipulation, learning to read men's deepest needs and present herself as the answer to their loneliness. She studied her targets carefully, adapting her personality to match their desires. For the religious, she became devoutly spiritual. For the intellectual, she transformed into a well-read conversationalist. For the grieving, she offered comfort and understanding. Her ability to become whatever a man needed was both her greatest weapon and her most chilling talent. Lyra, despite her youth, proved crucial to the operation's success. Her genuine-seeming innocence provided perfect cover for the family's activities. Suspicious guests found it impossible to maintain their weariness around a girl who seemed incapable of deception. She also served as the early warning system, her naturally friendly demeanor allowing her to extract information about guests' backgrounds, travel plans, and financial situations without raising suspicion. The logistics of disposal had been worked out with meticulous efficiency by the Grimm brothers. Victor had discovered a series of natural caves in the mountainside, accessible only through a concealed entrance behind a rockfall. Bodies could be carried there under cover of darkness and sealed behind loose stones where the mountain's chemistry would accelerate decomposition. Personal effects were carefully sorted. Anything valuable was kept, while items that might identify the victim were buried separately or destroyed. Gideon Thorne's role was perhaps the most crucial. His reputation in the region was beyond reproach, and his word carried weight with local authorities. When questions were occasionally raised about missing travelers, Gideon would solemnly confirm that the individual had indeed stayed at Shadowbrook Manor but had departed in good health and spirits. His weathered face and honest demeanor had never failed to satisfy even the most persistent inquirer. The spring of 1833 brought their second victim, a spice merchant named Caleb Vance from Azure Coast. Vance was transporting nearly 500 silver coins, the proceeds from a successful season's crop sales. He was a bachelor of 38, known for his reclusive nature and his practice of making business trips alone to avoid sharing profits with partners. Vance arrived on a rainy April evening, immediately drawn to the warmth and comfort of the manor. After weeks of uncomfortable travel, the sisters deployed their refined strategy with precision. Eleanor engaged him in business discussions, learning about his financial situation and travel plans. Isolde provided exceptional meals that made him reluctant to continue his journey. Lyra entertained him with lute music and innocent charm that reminded him of the daughter he'd never had. But it was Seraphina who sealed Vance's fate. On his third night at the manor, she found him reading alone in the common room, a leather-bound volume of poetry open on his lap. She approached with apparent shyness, asking if he might read aloud, as she had little education but loved the sound of beautiful words. For 2 hours, Vance read to Seraphina by lamplight, his voice growing stronger and more confident as she listened with rapt attention. When he finished, she placed her hand gently on his arm and told him he had the most beautiful voice she'd ever heard. The loneliness that had hardened around Vance's heart for decades began to crack. "I've never met anyone like you," he told her, his voice thick with emotion he'd suppressed for years. "You make me feel alive again." "Then don't leave tomorrow," Seraphina replied, her eyes reflecting the lamplight with perfect, calculated sincerity. "Stay another day. Let me listen to you read again." Vance extended his stay by a week, during which Seraphina gradually increased their intimacy, while Isolde began introducing small amounts of pokeweed extract into his evening tea. The symptoms began subtly: mild stomach discomfort, slight dizziness, nothing alarming enough to cause immediate concern. Vance attributed his malaise to the stress of travel and the emotional upheaval of his unexpected romantic feelings. On his final night at Shadowbrook Manor, Seraphina invited Vance to join her for a private dinner in her room. Isolde had prepared his favorite meal along with a bottle of wine laced with a carefully calculated dose of water hemlock extract. As Vance sat across from Seraphina in the intimate candlelight, sharing his dreams and fears with a woman he believed might change his life forever, he had no idea he was already dying. The poison worked exactly as Isolde had predicted. Vance's death appeared to be a sudden heart attack brought on by excitement and overexertion. His body was discovered the next morning in Seraphina's bed, apparently having died peacefully in his sleep after a night of passion. Even if a healer had been available to examine the body, the symptoms perfectly matched those of natural cardiac failure in a middle-aged man with a previously sedentary lifestyle. Vance was buried with appropriate solemnity in the manor's small cemetery, a final touch that Eleanor had added to their operation. A proper grave complete with a carved headstone gave the appearance of respectful treatment while actually serving as the perfect hiding place. The cemetery contained the graves of several generations of Blackwood family members, making additional burials unremarkable to local observers. Vance's money and valuable personal effects disappeared into the sisters' growing treasury, while his wagon and horses were sold to traveling merchants passing through weeks later. His disappearance was attributed to a decision to settle in Eldoria rather than return to Azure Coast, a plausible explanation that no one thought to question too closely. By the end of 1833, the sisters had perfected a system that was virtually undetectable. They had learned to space their crimes carefully, never targeting more than 4 or 5 victims per year to avoid creating patterns that might attract attention. They developed cover stories for guests who died at the manor, ranging from heart attacks to accidents to decisions to settle permanently in the West. Most importantly, they learned to trust each other completely, creating a conspiracy so tight that not even the slightest hint of their activities ever reached the outside world. Between 1834 and 1845, Shadowbrook Manor achieved a reputation that extended throughout the Mid-Atlantic region and beyond. Travelers spoke of it in the same reverent tones reserved for the finest establishments in Silverwood City or Ironwood City. The sisters had created something unprecedented, a remote mountain manor that provided luxury accommodations and service that rivaled the best urban hotels. Eleanor had expanded their legitimate business operations significantly. The manor now maintained a stable of quality horses for guests, operated a small distillery producing premium mountain spirits, and even offered guided hunting expeditions led by Gideon Thorne. These legal enterprises provided substantial income and, more importantly, gave the sisters a reputation as savvy businesswomen rather than simply innkeepers. The guest registry from this period, carefully preserved in the Eldorian State Archives, tells the story of their success. Merchants from Port Azure, politicians from Silverwood City, land speculators from Ironwood City, and adventurers from as far away as Starfall City sign their names in Eleanor's elegant ledger book. Many returned multiple times, becoming regular patrons who praised Shadowbrook Manor to their colleagues and friends. But hidden within this legitimate success was a carefully orchestrated killing machine that operated with clockwork precision. The sisters had refined their victim selection to an exact science. Serafina developed an almost supernatural ability to identify the men who would never be missed. The loners, the outcasts, the ones carrying secrets that made them avoid close relationships. Isolde's knowledge of poisons had expanded to include dozens of plant and mineral toxins, each with different symptoms and detection profiles. Lyra had learned to extract detailed personal information from guests through seemingly innocent conversation, and Eleanor coordinated everything with the precision of a military operation. During these years, they claimed approximately 43 victims, the exact number later found by the railroad surveyor. Each death was carefully planned and executed according to strict protocols that minimized risk while maximizing profit. The sisters developed detailed profiles of their targets, sometimes observing potential victims for weeks before making their final decision. Consider the case of Marcus Thorne, a land surveyor from the Northern Territories who arrived in September 1838. Thorne was conducting mapping work for the regional government, a job that required him to travel alone through remote areas for months at a time. He carried surveying equipment worth considerable money along with payment for his work and funds for purchasing land parcels he'd identified as investment opportunities. Eleanor immediately recognized Thorne as an ideal target. His work required extended absences from civilization, meaning his disappearance might not be noticed for months. His surveying activities provided a perfect cover story. He could easily have fallen victim to any number of natural hazards while working alone in dangerous territory. Most importantly, his somewhat antisocial personality meant he had few close friends who would pursue investigations if he failed to return. The sisters began their campaign immediately. Isolde prepared special meals featuring game Thorne had watched Gideon hunt, creating a connection between the food and the rugged mountain environment he found so appealing. Lyra engaged him in conversations about his mapping work, expressing fascination with his technical knowledge and making him feel appreciated for his expertise. Eleanor discussed potential land investments with him, positioning herself as a local expert who could help him identify profitable opportunities. But it was Serafina who provided the element that sealed Thorne's fate. She approached him not as a potential romantic conquest, but as a kindred spirit who shared his love of the wilderness. She revealed an apparently extensive knowledge of mountain flora and fauna gleaned from years of careful study that actually served her poison research. She accompanied him on short surveying expeditions around the manor's property, demonstrating a comfort with outdoor life that Thorne found irresistible. "I've never met a woman who understood the mountains the way you do," Thorne told her during one of their excursions, his professional reserve finally cracking. "Most people see only wilderness, but you see the beauty and the order underneath." "I've lived here all my life," Serafina replied, stepping closer to him as they stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. "The mountains have taught me things that books never could. Things about life, about death, about the balance between them." Thorne extended his planned 2-day stay into 3 weeks, ostensibly to conduct more thorough surveying work in the area, but actually because he had fallen completely under Serafina's spell. During this time, Isolde gradually introduced increasingly potent toxins into his food, creating symptoms that mimicked the early stages of mountain fever, a genuine hazard that had claimed the lives of several surveyors in recent years. The poison Isolde used for Thorne was her own innovation, an extract from destroying angel mushrooms that produced liver failure over the course of several days. The symptoms perfectly matched those of mountain fever, and even an experienced healer would have been unlikely to distinguish between the two conditions. Thorne's death appeared to be a tragic, but entirely predictable occupational hazard. His surveying equipment was sold to a merchant in Eldoria, while his detailed maps became part of Eleanor's growing collection of intelligence about the region's geography and resources. His body joined the others in the sealed mountain caves, while his name was added to the local records as another victim of the dangerous frontier lifestyle. The brilliance of the sisters' operation lay not just in their killing methods, but in their ability to maintain the illusion of respectability. They attended spiritual services in the nearby settlement of Shadowbrook, contributed generously to community causes, and maintained friendships with local families. Eleanor served on the board of the Regional Merchants Association, while Isolde provided medical assistance to neighboring farms during times of illness. Serafina taught Sunday school to local children, and Lyra organized social events that brought together isolated mountain families. This community involvement served multiple purposes. It provided them with alibis and character witnesses for times when questions might be raised about missing guests. It gave them access to information about travelers passing through the region. Most importantly, it established them as pillars of the community whose word would never be questioned by local authorities. "I've never experienced hospitality like this," he told Eleanor as he prepared to leave. "You and your sisters have created something truly special here. I'll be recommending this place to every traveler I meet." Eleanor smiled and accepted his generous payment, nearly double the standard rate, pressed into her hands with genuine gratitude. "We look forward to your return visit, Mr. Pendleton. Safe travels." But Arthur Pendleton would never complete his journey to Eldoria. His horse was found 3 days later, wandering riderless near Dragon's Tooth Gap. Pendleton himself had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and a mystery that would never be officially investigated. The assumption, logical enough for the dangerous frontier, was that he had fallen victim to bandits or wild animals. Only the Blackwood sisters knew the truth. Rolfe Grimm had been waiting in the woods a half-mile from the manor when Pendleton departed that morning. The immigrant was handy with tools and possessed the kind of quiet efficiency that made him valuable for tasks that required discretion. Pendleton never saw the blow that ended his life, delivered with a blacksmith's hammer to the base of his skull. His body was wrapped in canvas and buried in a predetermined location deep in the mountain forest, while his substantial purse of gold coins found its way back to Shadowbrook Manor. That night, the four sisters sat around their kitchen table counting Pendleton's money and planning their future. Eleanor had done the calculations. The amount they'd just acquired exceeded the manor's legitimate profits for an entire year. Serafina had proven that lonely men could be manipulated with shocking ease. Isolde had demonstrated that traces of evidence could be eliminated with the right knowledge of chemistry and mountaincraft. And Lyra had shown that even the most innocent-seeming person could keep terrible secrets. "He won't be missed for weeks," Eleanor said, stacking the gold coins with businesslike precision. "No family, no close friends, traveling alone to a place where no one knows him. Perfect." "It was almost too easy," Serafina added, still wearing the same gentle expression she'd used to comfort their victim. "He would have given us anything we asked for." What they had discovered that cold November night was something far more valuable than gold. They had discovered how to make people disappear. The winter of 1832 gave the sisters time to refine their technique and establish the protocols that would serve them for nearly 2 decades. Eleanor, with her keen business mind, developed a system for identifying ideal targets. The perfect victim was a man traveling alone, carrying substantial money, with few family connections and no fixed schedule that would raise immediate alarm if he failed to arrive at his destination. Isolde's role evolved beyond cooking and household management. Her knowledge of mountain plants expanded to include detailed study of toxins and their effects. Pokeweed berries, when properly prepared, could induce symptoms resembling cholera. Foxglove could cause heart failure that appeared natural. Water hemlock could kill within hours while leaving little trace. She established a hidden garden behind the main house where she cultivated these plants alongside legitimate herbs, creating a pharmaceutical arsenal disguised as a medicine patch. "You're not well, Rolfe," she said gently, moving closer to him with apparent concern. "The sedative is affecting your mind. You're seeing things that aren't real." "No." Rolfe's voice rose dangerously, and Isolde glanced toward the ceiling, hoping the guest upstairs hadn't been awakened. "I know what we've done. I know what you've made me do. And I know it has to stop." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Rolfe alternating between tearful confessions and angry accusations, while Isolde tried to calm him without alerting the rest of the household. She eventually managed to convince him to return to his cabin with a promise that they would discuss the situation later, after he'd had time to rest and clear his head. But Isolde knew there would be no later discussion. Rolfe Grimm had become a liability that threatened everything they'd built, and liabilities had to be eliminated. That evening, after their guest had retired for the night, Isolde prepared a special dinner for the Grimm brothers, a gesture of appreciation for their years of loyal service. She explained to Victor. The meal featured Rolf's favorite dishes along with Isolde's special spiced wine that contained enough concentrated foxglove extract to stop a man's heart within hours. Rolf died quietly in his sleep that night, his death attributed to the same heart condition that had supposedly claimed several of their guests over the years. Victor, who had consumed less of the poisoned wine due to his natural temperance, survived, but with significant cardiac damage that left him weakened and dependent on Isolde's medical care. Rolf's death solved their immediate problem but created new challenges. Victor, despite his physical weakness, began asking pointed questions about his brother's sudden demise. The similarities between Rolf's symptoms and those exhibited by several of their guests had not escaped his notice, and his loyalty to the sisters was wavering under the weight of suspicion and grief. Eleanor recognized that their operation was entering a critical phase. The network of trust and complicity that had protected them for nearly 2 decades was beginning to fracture, and any significant investigation would uncover evidence that even their considerable influence couldn't suppress. She began making contingency plans for the possibility that they might have to